The scream tore through the castle halls before anyone understood what was happening. Guards dropped their spears and ran toward the War Council chamber, where Alpha King Draven Ashford had been standing moments ago, strong and commanding, addressing his generals about the coming border dispute. Now he lay on the stone floor, his body shaking violently, his skin turning a strange shade of gray under the torchlight. Beta Commander Colin Marsh was the first to reach him. He dropped to his knees and pressed 2 fingers against the king's neck, searching for a pulse that felt faint and irregular, like a drumbeat losing its rhythm. "Get the healers now," Colin shouted, his voice cracking with a fear he rarely allowed himself to show. Draven's eyes fluttered open for a brief second. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper escaped his lips before his eyes rolled back and his body went still, though his chest continued to rise and fall in shallow, painful breaths. Servants rushed in, carrying water and cloths. Someone tried to lift his head. Another tore open his collar to let him breathe easier. But nothing helped. The king's temperature was rising by the second, his skin now burning hot to the touch despite its gray, lifeless color. Within minutes, the entire castle was awake. Word spread like wildfire through the stone corridors and out into the packlands beyond. The Alpha King was dying, and no one knew why. Colin ordered the strongest warriors to carry Draven to his private chambers. As they moved him, his body convulsed once more, and a low, pained groan escaped him. The warriors exchanged worried glances. They had seen him fight through injuries that would kill lesser men. They had watched him walk away from battles bleeding but standing tall. This was different. This felt like something creeping in the dark, silent and merciless, attacking from the inside. By the time they laid him on his bed, his personal physician, an elderly man named Edwin Frost, had arrived, along with 2 junior healers. Edwin had served the Ashford bloodline for over 30 years. He had treated Draven's father before him. He had seen wounds from claws, from blades, from magic strikes during territorial wars, but when he examined the king's condition, his weathered face went pale. "I don't understand," Edwin muttered. He pressed his palm against Draven's forehead, then checked his eyes, his pulse, and the color of his lips. "There's no wound, no bite mark, no sign of blood loss. His organs seem to be shutting down, but I cannot find the cause." "What do you mean you cannot find the cause?" Colin snapped, his patience thinning. "You have treated this pack for 3 decades. Look harder." Edwin ignored the sharp tone, focusing instead on his king. He tried every remedy he knew, mixing herbs that had once healed poison wounds, applying salves that had cured infections during the last Great War. Nothing worked. If anything, Draven's condition worsened with each passing hour. By dawn, the king had fallen into a deep, troubling sleep that no one could wake him from. His breathing had slowed to a dangerous pace. His skin, once tanned and healthy, had turned an ashen gray that frightened even the bravest warriors who guarded his door. News of the king's mysterious illness spread beyond the pack borders. Allied territories heard whispers of a curse, something dark and ancient, that had struck down the strongest alpha in the region. Some said an enemy pack had used forbidden magic. Others whispered of an old grudge finally returning to collect its due. Fear crept through the castle like a shadow, and no one, from the lowest servant to the highest general, knew what to believe. Colin stood outside the king's chamber, arms crossed, jaw tight. He had fought beside Draven since they were young pups training under the same masters. He had seen him break bones in battle and walk it off within days, thanks to his healing abilities as an alpha. This illness defied everything Colin understood about their kind. Alphas healed fast. Alphas were strong. Alphas did not simply collapse without explanation. Inside the chamber, Edwin Frost sat beside the bed, watching his king's chest rise and fall unevenly. He had already sent urgent messages to every healer he knew, near and far. He needed help, and he needed it quickly, because whatever afflicted Draven was not something ordinary medicine could cure. By midday, the first outside healer arrived, a witch named Priya Sen, from a neighboring territory known for her skill with curses and dark magic. She examined Draven for nearly an hour, chanting old words, tracing symbols in the air above his body, and burning strange herbs that filled the room with thick, bitter smoke. When she finished, she shook her head slowly. "There is no curse here," she said, wiping sweat from her brow. "At least, not one I recognize. If it were dark magic, I would feel a trace, a signature left behind by whoever cast it. There is nothing. This is something else." Colin's hands tightened into fists. "Then what is it?" Priya had no answer. She left the castle with a heavy heart, unable to help the king she had traveled 2 days to see. More healers arrived throughout that first day, and into the next. A physician from the Northern Territories examined Draven's blood and declared it looked poisoned, yet he could identify no known poison matching the symptoms. A healer skilled in ancient plant medicine tried remedies passed down through generations, remedies that had cured fevers no ordinary doctor could touch. Draven's fever did not break. If anything, it grew worse with each failed attempt. By the end of the second day, 5 healers had come and gone, each one defeated by a mystery they could not solve. The castle's mood grew darker with every failure. Servants whispered in corners, guards exchanged worried glances during their shifts. The younger pack members, who had grown up believing their Alpha King was untouchable, began to understand for the first time that even the strongest among them could fall. Colin barely slept. He paced the halls at night, checking on Draven every few hours, watching the healers work and fail again. He had sent word to every corner of their alliance, promising great rewards to anyone who could cure their king. Healers began traveling from farther territories, some taking days to arrive, driven by the promise of glory, or the genuine desire to help a king known for his fairness and strength. On the third day, a healer from the Fey Court arrived, escorted by 2 of her own guards. Her name was Leora, and she was known throughout the region for her ability to see through illusions and curses that fooled even the most skilled witches. She spent hours with Draven, using methods unfamiliar to the pack healers, drawing symbols in silver dust, and speaking in a language none of them understood. When she finally stepped back from the bed, her expression was troubled. "This is not Fey magic," she said quietly. "It is not shifter magic either. Whatever this is, it hides itself well. I sense something beneath the surface, something deliberate, but I cannot name it." "Deliberate?" Colin asked sharply. "You mean someone did this to him?" Leora hesitated before answering. "I cannot be certain, but my instincts tell me this illness did not arrive naturally. Something, or someone, caused this." Her words settled heavily over the room. If the king had been deliberately harmed, that meant an enemy walked among them, hidden and unseen, patient enough to watch their alpha suffer without revealing themselves. Colin ordered increased security throughout the castle. Every guard was questioned. Every servant who had contact with the king in the days before his collapse was interviewed. No one found anything suspicious. Draven had eaten his usual meals, trained with his usual warriors, and handled his usual duties. Nothing seemed out of place. Meanwhile, more healers continued to arrive and fail. A pack physician from the Eastern Territories tried bloodletting, an old and painful method rarely used anymore, hoping to draw out whatever poison lurked in Draven's veins. It did nothing but weaken him further. A witch, skilled in reversal spells, attempted to undo whatever curse might be affecting him, only to admit defeat when her magic found nothing to reverse. By the 5th day, 10 healers had failed. By the 7th day, 18 had come and gone, each one more baffled than the last. Draven's condition continued its slow, terrifying decline. His breathing grew shallower. His skin grew colder despite the fever burning within him. The strongest warrior in the 12 territories, the Alpha King who had never lost a single battle, was slipping away, and no one could stop it. Colin began to lose hope, though he never let it show in front of the others. He sat beside Draven's bed each night, speaking quietly to his unconscious friend, reminding him of battles they had won together, of promises they had made as young pups to always protect their pack. Draven never responded, but Colin kept talking anyway, refusing to believe this was truly the end. On the 9th day, the 25th healer arrived, a renowned physician named Aldrich Vane, who had once cured an entire village of a mysterious plague years earlier. He examined Draven for hours, testing theory after theory, trying remedy after remedy. When he finally stepped away from the bed, exhaustion and defeat clear on his face, the entire castle seemed to hold its breath. "I have never encountered anything like this," Aldrich admitted, his voice heavy with frustration. "Every symptom points somewhere different. It mimics poison, yet no poison matches it exactly. It mimics curse, yet no curse leaves this particular trace. I do not know how to help him." Colin stood in the doorway, watching the 25th healer pack his belongings and prepare to leave, just like the 24 before him. A cold, sinking feeling settled in his chest. If the greatest minds in medicine and magic could not save Draven, what hope remained? Outside the castle walls, life continued as it always had for most people, unaware of the crisis unfolding within those stone walls. Farmers tended their fields, merchants sold their goods, and in a small tavern several miles from the castle, a young woman named Elena Voss wiped down tables after a long shift, completely unaware that her ordinary life was about to collide with the fate of a kingdom. She had no idea that the answer everyone desperately searched for did not lie in ancient spells or rare herbs, but in something far simpler, something that had been overlooked precisely because it seemed too obvious for the great minds gathered around the king's bed. As the sun set on the 9th day of Draven's illness, the castle prepared for what many feared might be the final night of their king's life. Candles were lit throughout the halls in quiet vigil. Warriors stood guard with heavy hearts. And somewhere beyond the castle walls, fate was already setting into motion the unlikely chain of events that would soon bring an unassuming waitress face to face with the most powerful man in the 12 territories. None of them yet knew how close the answer truly was, or how differently the story would end from what everyone had already begun to accept as inevitable. Aldrich Vane's carriage rattled down the dirt road away from the castle, but his mind stayed fixed on the king, lying helpless in that grand chamber. In 20 years of practicing medicine, he had never walked away from a patient feeling so utterly defeated. He had cured plagues, mended broken bones that should have ended careers, and pulled fevers down from the edge of death more times than he could count. Yet this illness had beaten him completely, and it gnawed at his pride, even as exhaustion pulled at his eyes. Word of his failure reached the castle within the hour, carried by a young messenger who had followed his carriage partway to confirm the news everyone already suspected. 25 healers, 25 failures. The number hung over the castle like a dark cloud, heavier than any of the previous defeats because it represented something final, an ending point, where hope simply ran out. Colin Marsh stood at the window of his own quarters that night, staring out at the moonlit training grounds where he and Draven had sparred as boys. He remembered the first time Draven had beaten him in combat, both of them barely 12 years old, laughing despite bruised ribs and scraped knuckles. He remembered Draven's father placing the pack's ceremonial blade in his son's hands during the succession ceremony, the pride evident in every line of the old alpha's face. He remembered 100 moments that built the man now lying motionless in a bed, slipping further away with each passing hour. A knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Edwin Frost, the castle's own physician, looking older than Colin had ever seen him. Edwin's shoulders sagged as he entered the room, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. "I have failed him," Edwin finally said. 30 years I have served this family, and I could not save the son the way I saved the father from lesser wounds. I do not know what else to try. Colin placed a firm hand on the older man's shoulder. "You have not failed. This is not a normal illness, Edwin. 25 healers with skills far beyond ordinary medicine could not find the cause. This is something else entirely. Something hidden. Hidden or not, he is dying," Edwin said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. "I do not know how much longer his body can endure this." The two men sat together in heavy silence, the weight of failure pressing down on both of them. Outside, the castle continued its uneasy vigil, torches burning along the walls, guards standing watch with grim expressions, servants moving quietly through halls that usually buzzed with life and conversation. In a smaller wing of the castle, away from the grand chambers, a group of young pack members gathered in hushed conversation. Among them was a girl named Priscilla Hart, barely 16 years old, who had grown up idolizing the Alpha King as a symbol of everything strong and unshakable about their pack. "They say he might not survive the week," she whispered to her companions, tears welling in her eyes. "How can this be happening? He has never lost a fight in his life." "This isn't a fight he can win with strength," replied Marcus Doyle, an older boy training to become a warrior himself. "Whatever this is, it doesn't care how strong he is. It's attacking something strength cannot fix." Their conversation reflected the mood spreading throughout the entire territory. Word had traveled fast, reaching neighboring packs and allied kingdoms within days. Some worried what would happen to the alliance if their strongest leader fell. Others worried about opportunistic enemies who might see this as the perfect moment to strike while the pack's guard was down, distracted by grief and uncertainty. Rumors began circulating about possible causes. Some believed a rival pack had hired an assassin skilled in undetectable poisons. Others whispered about ancient family curses finally catching up to the Ashford bloodline after generations of victory and prosperity. A few even suggested that Draven himself had grown too powerful, and some greater force had decided to humble him. None of these theories brought comfort, and none of them offered any real path toward a cure. Meanwhile, Colin made a difficult decision. If 25 skilled healers could not identify the illness, perhaps the answer lay outside traditional medicine entirely. He called together his most trusted advisors, along with Edwin and a few remaining healers still present in the castle, determined to approach the problem from every possible angle. "We need to think differently," Colin told the gathered group late that night. "We have exhausted every known cure, every known diagnosis. Perhaps we are looking in the wrong places. Perhaps the answer requires someone who does not think like a healer at all." One of the advisors, a sharp-minded woman named Odette Ferris, who managed the castle's daily affairs, spoke up cautiously. "What do you mean by that, Commander?" "I mean perhaps we need someone with fresh eyes," Colin explained. "Someone unburdened by the assumptions that come with years of medical training. Sometimes the answer hides in plain sight, invisible, only because everyone is looking too hard in the same direction." The suggestion was met with skepticism from some in the room, but no one offered a better alternative. Desperation had a way of opening minds to possibilities that pride would normally reject. The following morning, Colin sent trusted scouts throughout the nearby villages and territories, instructed to gather information about anyone with unusual knowledge of illness or remedies, regardless of their formal training or lack thereof. It was a long shot, born from desperation rather than strategy, but with traditional methods failing so completely, Colin felt he had no other choice. Back in Draven's chamber, Edwin continued his vigil, checking the king's vital signs every hour, adjusting cool cloths against his burning forehead, trying anything he could think of to ease his suffering even without a cure. Draven's breathing had grown so shallow that Edwin found himself holding his own breath sometimes, waiting anxiously for the next rise of the king's chest. During a brief moment of consciousness that afternoon, Draven's eyes opened weakly, and he seemed to recognize Edwin sitting beside him. His lips moved, forming words too faint to fully hear. "The pack," he whispered. "Protect the pack." Edwin leaned closer, his heart aching at the sight of his powerful king reduced to whispered pleas. "The pack is safe, my lord. Colin has everything under control. You must focus on fighting this illness." Draven's eyes fluttered closed again before he could respond further, slipping back into the deep, troubled sleep that had claimed most of his recent days. Colin, informed immediately of this brief moment of consciousness, felt a small flicker of hope reignite within him. If Draven could still surface, even briefly, perhaps there remained a chance to save him, if only they could find the right answer in time. Days passed with agonizing slowness. The castle settled into a strange rhythm of grief and desperate hope, servants moving quietly through their duties, while warriors maintained heightened security at every entrance. Scouts returned from nearby villages with little useful information, mostly rumors and unverified claims that led nowhere productive. On the 12th day since Draven's collapse, one scout returned with an interesting piece of information, though it seemed insignificant at first glance. He mentioned a small tavern several miles from the castle, known locally for good food, and an unusually observant young waitress, who had once correctly identified a merchant's illness before any physician arrived, simply by paying close attention to small details others overlooked. Colin barely registered this piece of information among dozens of other reports flooding in daily, each one promising some new lead that ultimately amounted to nothing. He filed it away in his mind without much thought, focused instead on managing the growing unrest within the pack, and the mounting pressure from allied territories anxious about their king's fate. That same evening, however, fate intervened in a way no one could have predicted. Odette Ferris, exhausted from days of managing castle affairs during the crisis, decided to send a trusted steward named Gareth Hollis to a nearby tavern to collect supplies and clear his head after days of stressful confinement within castle walls. It was a small, seemingly unimportant errand, the kind of task that happened dozens of times each week without any significance attached to it. Gareth Hollis had served the castle for nearly 10 years, a quiet and dependable man, known for his attention to detail and his loyalty to the Ashford family. He had watched Draven grow from a determined young alpha into the respected king, now fighting for his life, and the weight of recent events pressed heavily on his shoulders as he made his way toward the tavern that evening, hoping a change of scenery might ease his troubled mind, if only briefly. He had no idea that this simple errand would soon connect him to the one person capable of solving a mystery that had defeated 25 of the most skilled healers in the 12 territories. As Gareth's carriage rolled down the familiar road toward the small tavern, the castle behind him remained locked in its desperate vigil, unaware that the answer to their prayers sat waiting patiently within a modest building most of them had never even noticed existed. The tavern, known as the Copper Kettle, sat at the edge of a small village, its wooden sign creaking gently in the evening breeze. Inside, warm firelight flickered against stone walls, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. Laughter and quiet conversation drifted between tables, a stark contrast to the heavy silence that had settled over the castle these past 12 days. Elena Voss moved between tables with practiced ease, balancing plates and pouring drinks, her dark hair tied back and a tired but genuine smile on her face. She had worked at the Copper Kettle for nearly 3 years, ever since her mother's passing had left her responsible for supporting herself entirely on her own. It was not a glamorous life, but it was honest work, and Elena took pride in doing it well. She had a habit that her coworkers often teased her about. She noticed things, small things, the way a customer's hands trembled slightly before they mentioned feeling unwell, the particular shade of someone's skin when they hadn't slept properly in days, the way certain smells lingered on people who had been near specific herbs or medicines. It wasn't magic, and Elena never claimed to be anything special. It was simply a skill she had picked up from her mother, who had spent years working as a healer's assistant before circumstances forced her into different work. Her mother, Margaret Voss, had rarely spoken about those years, but occasionally, especially during quiet evenings, she would share small pieces of knowledge with young Elena, teaching her how to recognize the signs of common illnesses, how certain symptoms told a story if you knew how to read them, and how the simplest explanations were often overlooked because people assumed complicated problems required complicated solutions. "Remember, Elena," her mother had told her once, years ago, while treating a neighbor's persistent cough, "the body speaks a language of its own. You just need to learn how to listen properly. Sometimes the answer sits right in front of everyone, hiding only because nobody bothers to look closely enough." Elena had carried those words with her ever since, though she rarely had reason to apply them beyond small moments, like recognizing when a regular customer was coming down with a cold before they realized it themselves, or noticing when someone's fatigue stemmed from something more concerning than simple tiredness. That evening, as she cleared tables near closing time, the tavern door swung open, and a well-dressed man stepped inside, looking exhausted and troubled. Elena recognized him as a castle steward, someone who occasionally passed through the village on errands, though she had never spoken with him directly before. Gareth Hollis settled into a corner table, ordering a simple meal and a strong drink, his shoulders slumped with visible fatigue. Elena approached to take his order, noticing immediately the dark circles under his eyes and the tension evident in every line of his posture. "Rough day?" she asked gently, setting a cup of water in front of him before he had even finished ordering. Gareth looked up, momentarily surprised by the question, before offering a tired, humorless laugh. "You could say that. Rough week, more accurately. Rough 2 weeks, if I am being honest." Elena lingered a moment longer than usual, something about the man's demeanor catching her attention. "I don't mean to pry, but you look like someone carrying a heavy burden. Is everything all right?" Gareth hesitated, glancing around the mostly empty tavern before lowering his voice. "It's not something I should discuss, really. Castle business, very sensitive matters right now." Elena nodded understandingly and moved to step away, respecting his privacy, but Gareth suddenly spoke again, almost as though the words simply needed somewhere to go after being contained for too long. "Our king is dying," he said quietly, staring down at his cup. 25 healers have tried to save him. 25 failures. Nobody knows what's wrong with him, and every day, he grows weaker. I fear we may lose him within days, and honestly, I don't know what will become of the pack if that happens." Elena felt a chill run through her at these words. Everyone in the region knew of Alpha King Draven Ashford, even those like Elena who had no direct connection to pack politics or royal matters. His reputation as a fair and strong leader extended far beyond his own territory, and the idea that such a powerful figure now lay dying from an unknown illness struck her as deeply unsettling. "What are his symptoms?" she asked, curiosity mixing with genuine concern. Gareth glanced up, slightly surprised by her interest, but exhaustion made him less guarded than usual. High fever that will not break, skin turning an unusual gray color, weakness throughout his entire body. His breathing has grown shallow, and he drifts in and out of consciousness. The healers say it mimics poison, but no poison matches his exact symptoms. It mimics curse, but the witches and fae healers find no trace of dark magic. Nobody understands what is truly wrong with him. Elena's mind immediately began working through the details, old memories stirring from years of watching her mother diagnose similar cases in the village. She hesitated, unsure whether to share her thoughts with a stranger, discussing matters far beyond her usual concerns. "Has anyone considered it might be something simpler than poison or curse?" she asked carefully. Sometimes illnesses that mimic serious conditions have surprisingly ordinary explanations. Gareth looked at her with mild curiosity, though clearly skeptical given the situation. "The finest healers in the 12 territories have examined him. I doubt something simple would have escaped their notice." Elena shrugged slightly, not wanting to overstep, though something about the description nagged persistently at her memory. "My mother used to say that complicated situations often blind people to simple truths. Skilled healers sometimes look for complex answers because they assume ordinary explanations wouldn't be missed by everyone else." Gareth studied her for a long moment. Something about her calm confidence made him pause. "You speak as though you have some experience with such matters." "My mother worked as a healer's assistant for many years before I was born," Elena explained. "She taught me small things growing up, ways to recognize illness, patterns that repeat in certain conditions. Nothing formal, nothing like the training your healers have received. Just practical knowledge passed down within our family." Gareth fell silent for a moment, considering her words carefully. The desperation of the past 2 weeks had worn down his usual skepticism, and something about this young woman's calm certainty struck him as different from the panicked theories and failed remedies he had witnessed within castle walls. "What would your mother have looked for in a case like this?" he asked finally, curiosity overcoming his hesitation. Elena thought carefully before answering, pulling together threads of memory from years of watching her mother work. She always said to look at patterns first. When did the symptoms begin? Did they appear suddenly or build gradually? What changed in the person's routine right before symptoms started? Sometimes the answer isn't found through examining the illness itself, but through examining what happened just before it began. Gareth considered this, something shifting in his expression. The king collapsed suddenly during a war council meeting. There was no warning beforehand, no gradual decline that anyone noticed. And in the days before that, did anything change? New foods, new routines, new people around him? Elena pressed gently, her curiosity now fully engaged despite herself. Gareth opened his mouth to answer, then paused, genuinely trying to recall details he hadn't previously considered relevant. "I don't know, honestly. I haven't been asked those questions before. Everyone is focused entirely on his symptoms after collapse, not what led up to it." Elena nodded slowly, her mind working through possibilities, though she recognized she had no way to properly investigate without seeing the king herself. "It's just a thought. I could be completely wrong. I have no formal training, and your healers likely already considered such details." Gareth studied her for a long moment, an idea slowly forming despite his exhaustion. The castle had exhausted every conventional avenue, every renowned healer within reach. Perhaps it was worth considering something unconventional, especially given how desperate the situation had become. "Would you be willing to come to the castle?" he asked suddenly, surprising even himself with the question. "Perhaps look at the situation yourself, share whatever thoughts you might have?" Elena blinked, startled by the unexpected invitation. "I'm just a waitress, sir. I have no formal medical training. Surely the castle wouldn't welcome someone like me examining their king." "Desperate times call for unconventional measures," Gareth replied, his voice carrying newfound determination despite his fatigue. 25 skilled healers have failed. What harm could come from one more perspective, even an unconventional one? I cannot promise how you would be received, but I believe it is worth the attempt, given how little time may remain. Elena hesitated, torn between the responsibilities of her current life and the strange pull of this unexpected opportunity. She glanced around the familiar tavern, thinking of her modest but stable existence, and then thought of a king, suffering from an illness that had defeated the greatest minds in the region. "Let me speak with my employer," she said finally, decision settling within her, despite the uncertainty ahead. If he can manage without me for a short time, I will come with you. Gareth nodded, relief evident on his tired features. Thank you. I cannot promise this will lead anywhere, but I believe it is worth trying, given everything else has failed. As Elena walked toward the kitchen to speak with her employer, she felt a strange mixture of nervousness and determination settling within her. She had no idea what awaited her at the castle, no certainty that her simple observations would prove useful, where the finest healers in the 12 territories had failed completely. But something about Gareth's description of the king's symptoms had stirred a persistent feeling within her, a feeling she couldn't quite shake, whispering that perhaps the answer truly was simpler than everyone had assumed. Within the hour, Elena found herself seated in Gareth's carriage, watching the familiar village disappear behind her as they made their way toward the castle looming in the distance, its towers silhouetted against the darkening evening sky. She had no idea that this journey would soon place her directly before the most powerful man in the 12 territories, or that her simple observations were about to accomplish what 25 skilled healers could not. The carriage rolled through the towering castle gates, just as the last light of evening faded into darkness. Elena pressed her fingers against the window, staring up at the massive stone structure rising before her, larger and more imposing than anything she had ever seen up close. Guards stood at attention along the walls, their expressions grim, and torches burned along every visible walkway, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Gareth led her through a side entrance, moving quickly through corridors that grew increasingly grand the further they walked. Elena felt distinctly out of place in her simple tavern clothes, still smelling faintly of roasted meat and spilled ale, surrounded by polished stone floors and tapestries, depicting battles and victories she knew nothing about. "Wait here," Gareth instructed, as they reached a large set of doors, guarded by 2 stern-faced warriors. "I need to speak with Commander Marsh before bringing you further." Elena nodded, standing awkwardly in the corridor, as Gareth disappeared through the doors. She could hear muffled voices from within, and after several minutes, the doors opened again, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes and an expression carved from exhaustion and barely contained frustration. This, she realized, must be Commander Colin Marsh, the beta she had heard mentioned in passing conversations throughout the village. Colin studied her for a long moment, his gaze skeptical and assessing. "Gareth tells me you have some experience with illness diagnosis." "I have some practical knowledge, passed down from my mother," Elena replied carefully, trying to keep her voice steady despite the intimidating presence before her. "I want to be honest, Commander. I have no formal training. I am simply a waitress who noticed certain patterns growing up around my mother's work." Colin's expression remained unreadable, though something in his eyes suggested he was weighing her words carefully against his own desperation. 25 healers with extensive formal training have failed to identify what ails our king. I am skeptical that a waitress with no formal training could succeed where they could not. "I understand your skepticism completely, Commander," Elena replied honestly. "I make no promises. I am simply willing to look, if you believe it might help, even slightly." Colin studied her a moment longer, before finally nodding, though clear reluctance remained in his expression. "Very well, but I must warn you. Others within this castle will not receive your presence kindly. Many have grown desperate, and desperation breeds impatience toward anything that seems unconventional." He led her through the doors and down another long corridor, finally arriving at a grand chamber, where several nobles and remaining healers had gathered, discussing quietly among themselves. The moment Elena entered, conversation stopped, and dozens of eyes turned toward her, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open disdain. "Commander, surely this is a jest," said an older woman dressed in fine healer's robes, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You bring a common waitress before us, expecting her to succeed where 25 trained healers have failed?" "I bring her because we have exhausted every other option," Colin replied firmly, his tone leaving little room for argument. "I would rather explore every possibility than watch our king slip away while we cling stubbornly to methods that have already proven ineffective." Murmurs of disagreement rippled through the gathered crowd, but Colin's authority as beta commander held enough weight to silence most objections, even if resentment remained clearly visible on many faces. Elena felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, doubt creeping into her own confidence despite her earlier resolve. She had never faced such open scrutiny before, and the grandeur of her surroundings, only emphasized how far removed she was from the world these people inhabited daily. "This way," Colin said, gesturing toward another set of doors leading deeper into the castle. Elena followed, aware of the whispered comments and skeptical glances trailing behind her as she walked. They finally arrived at a private chamber, smaller than the grand hall, but still far more luxurious than anything Elena had ever entered. Inside, an elderly man sat beside a large bed, his face etched with exhaustion and worry. This, Elena assumed, must be Edwin Frost, the castle's own physician she had heard mentioned during Gareth's earlier explanation. And there, lying motionless against pristine white sheets, was Alpha King Draven Ashford himself. Elena had expected to feel intimidated by the presence of royalty, but the moment her eyes fell upon him, all such thoughts vanished, replaced entirely by professional focus, honed through years of watching her mother work. She saw past the crown and the title, seeing instead a patient, exactly like any of the many patients her mother had once treated in their small village home. His skin held that unusual gray tone Gareth had described, stretched tight across features that clearly belonged to someone who had once carried significant strength and vitality. His breathing was shallow, each inhale requiring visible effort. Dark circles surrounded his closed eyes, and sweat beaded across his forehead despite the coolness of the room. Edwin looked up as they entered, surprise evident on his tired face. "Commander, who is this?" "Someone willing to look at the situation with fresh eyes," Colin explained, though his tone carried a note of uncertainty even now. "This is Elena Voss. She has some practical experience with illness recognition." Edwin's expression shifted from surprise to skepticism, though exhaustion tempered whatever objection he might have voiced under different circumstances. "With respect, Commander, we have exhausted every avenue of formal medical knowledge, and I fail to see what informal experience could accomplish where trained expertise has failed." "I understand your doubts completely," Elena said gently, stepping closer to the bed despite the tension radiating from everyone around her. "I promise nothing, sir. I simply wish to observe, if you would permit it." Edwin studied her for a long moment, before finally nodding, too exhausted to maintain strong resistance against Colin's evident authority in bringing her here. "Very well. Observe if you must, though I doubt you will find anything we have missed." Elena approached the bed slowly, her earlier nervousness fading as familiar instincts took over. Instincts trained through years of watching her mother diagnose patients in their small village home. She studied Draven's face carefully, noting the particular gray undertone to his skin, different from simple paleness or typical fever flush. She leaned closer, examining his breathing pattern, counting the shallow rises and falls of his chest. She noticed the way his fingers occasionally twitched slightly, a subtle tremor that seemed almost rhythmic rather than random. "How long have these tremors been present?" she asked, addressing Edwin directly. Edwin blinked, clearly surprised by the specific question. "Tremors? I had not particularly noted any tremors." Elena gently lifted Draven's hand, showing Edwin the subtle twitching in his fingers. "Here, watch closely. It's faint, but it's there, and it seems to follow a pattern, almost like a heartbeat rhythm, rather than random muscle spasms." Edwin leaned closer, watching carefully, his skeptical expression shifting slightly into genuine curiosity despite himself. I had not noticed this before. You are right, there does seem to be a pattern." Colin, standing near the doorway, watched this exchange with growing interest, something in Elena's calm confidence beginning to chip away at his earlier skepticism. Elena continued her examination, leaning close to check Draven's breath, her brow furrowing slightly as she caught a faint scent beneath the obvious smell of illness and fever. She leaned closer still, breathing in carefully, trying to identify the underlying note hidden beneath more obvious odors. "Has he consumed anything unusual recently?" she asked, straightening up. "Any new foods, drinks, medicines, anything at all that changed in his routine before he collapsed?" Edwin frowned thoughtfully. "We asked such questions early in our investigation. Nothing unusual was reported. He ate his usual meals, prepared as always by the castle kitchen staff." "What about drinks? Tea? Wine? Anything specifically prepared just for him?" Elena pressed, her mind working carefully through possibilities, as memories of her mother's teachings surfaced from years past. Edwin paused, considering the question more carefully this time. "He does drink a special tea each morning, prepared specifically according to an old family recipe meant to aid focus and energy before council meetings. It has been part of his routine for years, long before his current illness began. Elena's attention sharpened immediately at this detail. Has anything changed about this tea recently? Different ingredients, different preparation, different person preparing it? Edwin hesitated, clearly trying to recall details that had seemed unimportant during previous investigations, focused primarily on more obvious potential causes. I believe the usual preparer fell ill several weeks ago, replaced temporarily by someone else. I cannot recall the exact timing, compared to when the king's symptoms began. Elena felt a small spark of certainty igniting within her, though she remained cautious about drawing conclusions too quickly. I would like to see this tea, if possible, and speak with whoever currently prepares it. Colin, listening intently from the doorway, stepped forward with newfound urgency. I will have it brought immediately, along with whoever currently handles its preparation. As Colin departed to arrange this, Edwin studied Elena with an expression that had shifted considerably from his earlier skepticism. You truly believe something as simple as his morning tea could be responsible for all of this? Elena met his gaze steadily, drawing on every lesson her mother had taught her through years of quiet, patient instruction. I don't know for certain, sir, but sometimes the answer that seems too simple to consider is exactly the one everyone overlooks, precisely because it seems too obvious to be true. Edwin said nothing further, though something in his weathered expression suggested he was beginning, cautiously, to hope that perhaps this unconventional waitress might succeed where 25 trained healers had failed so completely. Word spread quickly through the castle that Commander Marsh had brought an outsider, a common waitress, to examine the king. By the time Colin returned with the tea and its temporary preparer, a small crowd of nobles, remaining healers, and curious servants had gathered near the chamber doors, drawn by disbelief and desperate curiosity in equal measure. Among them stood Lady Vivian Ashworth, a distant cousin of the royal bloodline who had positioned herself close to the throne for years, always present during important gatherings, always offering opinions on matters of state. She watched Elena with narrowed eyes, arms crossed tightly over her elegant gown. This is absurd, she muttered to a nearby noble. The finest minds in the 12 territories have failed, and now Commander Marsh entertains fantasies from a tavern girl. This castle has clearly lost its senses in its grief. Her companion, a young lord named Percival Grant, nodded in agreement, though his eyes remained fixed curiously on the scene unfolding within the chamber. Perhaps desperation excuses unconventional measures, though I agree, it seems unlikely anything meaningful will come from this. Inside the chamber, Colin returned with a servant, carrying a small ceramic pot, along with a nervous young woman trailing behind him. This was Fiona Blackwood, a kitchen maid, who had temporarily taken over preparation of the king's special morning tea after the usual preparer, an elderly woman named Constance Reeves, had fallen ill several weeks earlier. Fiona's hands trembled slightly as she entered the chamber, clearly intimidated by the gathered authority figures and the gravity of the situation. I have done nothing differently, my lord. I followed the recipe exactly as Constance taught me before she took ill. Elena approached gently, offering the young maid a reassuring smile, despite the tension filling the room. I am not here to accuse you of anything, Fiona. I simply wish to understand the tea's preparation, that's all. Please, take a breath. This is not an interrogation. Fiona relaxed slightly under Elena's calm demeanor, nodding gratefully. Yes, of course. What would you like to know? Walk me through the preparation, step by step, Elena instructed. Every ingredient, every measurement, exactly as you learned it. Fiona nodded and began explaining carefully, listing herbs and roots that Elena recognized from her mother's teachings, familiar ingredients, used commonly throughout the region for energy and focus. Nothing seemed immediately alarming, until Fiona mentioned one particular ingredient toward the end of her explanation. And then I add a small measure of ground root powder, sourced from the eastern gardens, exactly as Constance instructed. Fiona finished, gesturing toward a small jar sitting among other ingredients that had been brought along with the tea itself. Elena's attention sharpened immediately. May I see this root powder? Fiona handed over the small jar, and Elena opened it carefully, bringing it close to her nose. The scent was familiar, yet something about it seemed subtly different from what she expected, a faint bitterness underlying the otherwise pleasant aroma. Has this particular batch of root powder come from a different source than usual? Elena asked, studying the powder's texture and color carefully. Fiona hesitated, thinking carefully. Now that you mention it, yes. Our usual supplier ran short several weeks ago, right around when Constance fell ill. I was told to source a replacement batch from a different merchant temporarily. Elena felt her pulse quicken slightly, pieces beginning to align in her mind. Do you recall approximately when this new batch began being used? Fiona thought for a long moment before answering. I believe it was introduced perhaps 2 or 3 days before the king's collapse. I remember, because the merchant delivering it commented on how fresh and potent this particular batch appeared compared to previous shipments. Colin, listening intently nearby, stepped forward with growing urgency evident in his expression. You believe this root powder might be responsible? Elena held up a cautious hand, unwilling to make premature declarations, despite the mounting evidence aligning in her mind. I cannot be certain without further examination, Commander, but there are certain root varieties that closely resemble beneficial herbs, while carrying subtly different properties that can prove dangerous when consumed daily over an extended period, especially in concentrated form. Edwin, who had remained quiet during this exchange, stepped closer, his physician's curiosity now fully engaged. You believe this could explain the symptoms we have observed? The fever, the gray skin tone, the shallow breathing? It is possible, Elena replied carefully. Certain root varieties, when they closely resemble common beneficial herbs but carry different underlying properties, can cause a slow accumulation effect within the body. Rather than an immediate, obvious reaction, the effects build gradually with each dose, eventually reaching a critical point where the body simply cannot cope any longer. She turned back to examine Draven more closely, lifting his hand again to check the subtle tremor she had noticed earlier. This pattern of tremor, combined with the gray skin tone and shallow breathing, matches symptoms I recall my mother once describing, regarding certain toxic root varieties that mimic beneficial herbs closely enough to escape casual notice. Lady Vivian, who had pushed her way closer to observe the proceedings despite her earlier dismissiveness, scoffed loudly enough for others to hear. This is ridiculous. 25 trained healers examined his blood, his symptoms, every conceivable factor, and found nothing resembling poison. Now a waitress claims to identify the cause simply by smelling tea ingredients. Elena remained calm, despite the pointed criticism, understanding the skepticism, even as frustration simmered quietly beneath her composed exterior. I understand your doubt, my lady. However, I would suggest that the reason 25 healers failed to identify this particular substance is precisely because it closely resembles a common, beneficial herb. Their tests likely searched for known poisons with distinct signatures, not a naturally occurring root variety that appears harmless under most examinations, revealing its true danger only through prolonged, concentrated exposure. Edwin, considering this explanation carefully, nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression, as pieces began aligning with his own observations over recent days. This would explain why our tests found no clear poison signature. If this substance closely mimics a known beneficial herb, standard poison detection methods might overlook it entirely, assuming it to be the harmless ingredient it resembles. Colin, watching this exchange unfold with growing hope mixed with cautious skepticism, stepped forward. If this is truly the cause, what must be done? How do we reverse whatever damage has already occurred? Elena considered this question carefully, drawing again on memories of her mother's teachings, specific remedies used for cases involving similar toxic accumulation within the body. The antidote, if my suspicion proves correct, would not require rare or complicated ingredients. It would involve flushing the toxin from his system, while supporting his body's natural recovery processes, using ingredients likely already available within any well-stocked kitchen. This statement drew immediate skepticism from several onlookers, including a remaining healer named Bartholomew Finch, who had been present throughout much of the investigation. You claim the cure for what has defeated 25 skilled healers requires nothing more than common kitchen ingredients. This seems highly improbable. I understand how it sounds, Elena replied honestly, meeting his skeptical gaze directly, despite the pressure surrounding her. But sometimes serious problems have surprisingly simple solutions, especially when the underlying cause itself turns out to be something ordinary rather than exotic. If my diagnosis proves correct, the remedy should work quickly, and we will know within hours whether this approach succeeds. Colin studied Elena carefully, weighing her confidence against the mounting skepticism surrounding them both. 25 failures had taught the castle painful lessons about false hope, yet something about this young woman's calm certainty, backed by specific, logical reasoning, rather than mystical claims or complicated theories, struck him as different from everything they had tried before. "What do you need to prepare this remedy?" Colin asked finally, decision settling firmly despite the doubt still lingering among many gathered around them. Elena listed several common ingredients, items she knew would be readily available within any castle kitchen, explaining briefly how each component would work together to help flush the toxin from Draven's system, while supporting his weakened body through the recovery process. As servants rushed to gather the requested ingredients, tension filled the chamber, hope and doubt mixing uneasily among those present. Lady Vivian continued muttering skeptical comments to those nearby, while others watched with cautious optimism, desperate for any solution after 12 agonizing days of failure and fear. Edwin moved closer to Elena, his expression thoughtful. "If you are correct, this discovery will save our king's life, where 25 trained healers failed completely. If you are wrong, however, I fear the consequences for both your reputation and our remaining hope will be severe." Elena met his gaze steadily, her earlier nervousness having faded entirely, replaced by quiet confidence born from years of careful observation and her mother's patient teachings. "I understand the stakes fully, sir. But I would rather try and fail than watch him continue suffering, while everyone assumes the answer must be complicated, simply because it has eluded so many skilled minds." As the necessary ingredients arrived, Elena began preparing the remedy carefully, her hands steady, despite the weight of expectation pressing down upon her from every direction. Colin watched closely, along with Edwin and the remaining skeptical onlookers, all waiting anxiously to discover whether this unconventional waitress had truly identified what 25 trained healers had completely overlooked. Elena worked with quiet efficiency, measuring each ingredient carefully into a small bowl, before mixing them into a warm liquid that Edwin had prepared, according to her instructions. Ginger root, a small measure of honey, crushed mint leaves, and a few other common items, combined into a mixture that smelled surprisingly pleasant despite its serious purpose. "This mixture will help flush the toxin from his system," Elena explained as she worked, addressing both Edwin and Colin directly, though her words carried to the wider group gathered near the doorway. "The ginger will help settle his stomach and support digestion, allowing his body to process and eliminate the toxin more effectively. The honey provides gentle energy his weakened body desperately needs, while the mint will help ease the tension in his breathing." Lady Vivian, still standing near the doorway with arms crossed, shook her head slowly. "This is madness. You expect us to believe common kitchen herbs will succeed where the finest medical knowledge in the 12 territories has failed?" Edwin, who had grown increasingly thoughtful throughout the entire process, turned toward her with unexpected firmness in his tired voice. "My lady, I have practiced medicine for 30 years. I have seen remarkable cures come from surprisingly simple sources, and I have watched complicated, expensive treatments fail against illnesses that ultimately required nothing more than patience and basic care. I am willing to consider any possibility at this point, given how completely we have failed thus far." His words seemed to quiet some of the skepticism in the room, though tension remained thick as Elena finished preparing the mixture and approached Draven's bedside once more. "He needs to consume this slowly," Elena instructed, addressing Edwin directly. "If my diagnosis is correct, we should begin seeing improvement within a few hours, as his body starts processing the toxin more effectively. His fever should begin breaking first, followed gradually by improved color and easier breathing." Edwin nodded, carefully lifting Draven's head, while Elena helped guide the warm liquid gently past his lips, small sip by small sip, patient and careful despite his unconscious state. The king's throat moved reflexively, swallowing the liquid slowly as Elena continued the careful process. The chamber fell into tense silence as everyone watched, waiting for any sign that this unconventional treatment might succeed where everything else had failed so completely. Minutes passed slowly, the only sounds being Draven's shallow breathing and the occasional shifting of onlookers near the doorway. "How long before we might see results?" Colin asked quietly, his earlier skepticism now fully replaced by desperate hope. "It could take several hours before visible improvement appears," Elena replied honestly. The toxin has likely accumulated within his system over multiple days. Flushing it out and allowing his body to recover will take time, though I would expect some initial signs, perhaps a slight easing of his fever, within the first hour or two, if this treatment proves effective. The gathered crowd slowly dispersed over the following hour, most returning to their usual duties or retreating to their own quarters, though clear tension remained throughout the castle as word of this unconventional treatment spread quickly among servants and nobles alike. Some expressed hopeful curiosity, while others, like Lady Vivian, continued voicing skeptical dismissal to anyone willing to listen. Colin remained in the chamber, along with Edwin, both watching Draven closely for any sign of change. Elena stayed as well, her earlier nervousness replaced by focused attention, as she monitored her king's condition, alongside the two men who had initially doubted her so thoroughly. Nearly 2 hours passed before the first noticeable change appeared. Edwin, checking Draven's temperature carefully, suddenly straightened with visible surprise. His fever has dropped, just slightly, but it has dropped. Elena moved closer, checking for herself, relief flooding through her, as she confirmed Edwin's observation. The burning heat that had radiated from Draven's skin for nearly 2 weeks had indeed decreased, subtle, but undeniably present. Colin, who had been pacing near the window, rushed over immediately, his expression a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "Are you certain? Could this simply be a natural fluctuation, unrelated to the treatment?" Edwin shook his head slowly, his physician's expertise now fully engaged, despite his earlier skepticism. "I have monitored his fever consistently throughout the past 12 days. It has remained stubbornly high regardless of any treatment attempted, never fluctuating downward, even slightly. This change, however small, represents something genuinely different." As the night progressed, further small improvements continued appearing. Draven's breathing, while still shallow, seemed to deepen slightly compared to earlier in the evening. The gray undertone of his skin, while still present, appeared marginally less pronounced under careful examination. Edwin monitored these changes meticulously, documenting each small shift, with growing amazement evident in his expression. "This is remarkable. In 12 days, nothing we attempted produced even the slightest improvement. Now, within hours of this treatment, we are seeing genuine, measurable progress." Colin, watching his king's condition improve for the first time since this crisis began, felt emotion overwhelming him that he struggled to contain. He turned toward Elena, studying her with an expression that had transformed completely from his earlier doubt into something approaching genuine awe. "You solved this in mere minutes," he said quietly, almost to himself. 25 trained healers, some of the finest minds across the 12 territories, spent days examining him, testing theory after theory, and found nothing. You walked into this chamber, observed him for perhaps a minute, asked a few simple questions, and identified something they completely overlooked. Elena shook her head modestly, though a small, tired smile crossed her features at his words. "I was fortunate, Commander. I simply recognized a pattern my mother once taught me, nothing more. Had circumstances been slightly different, I might have overlooked it entirely, just as everyone else did." Modesty aside, Edwin interjected, his voice carrying newfound respect. "What you accomplished here tonight cannot be dismissed as mere fortune. You listened carefully, asked the right questions, and connected details that 25 skilled healers, myself included, completely failed to consider. This required genuine skill and insight, regardless of your lack of formal training." As the night wore on, Elena remained by Draven's bedside, continuing to monitor his condition alongside Edwin, both watching carefully for any signs of complications or setbacks. Colin eventually retreated briefly to inform key advisors of this unexpected progress, though he returned quickly, unwilling to remain away from the chamber for long given the significance of the unfolding situation. By the early hours of morning, Draven's fever had dropped substantially, no longer the dangerous, burning heat that had threatened his life for nearly 2 weeks. His breathing had deepened considerably, no longer requiring the visible effort that had worried everyone so deeply throughout his illness. The gray undertone of his skin had faded noticeably, replaced gradually by healthier color returning to his features. Edwin, exhausted but overjoyed, turned toward Elena with genuine gratitude evident in his weathered expression. "I do not know how to properly thank you. You have accomplished something I feared was impossible after watching 25 skilled colleagues fail so completely. Elena, equally exhausted after the long night of careful monitoring, offered a tired but genuine smile. I am simply relieved this treatment proved effective. I could not have forgiven myself had my suspicion been wrong, given how much hope everyone placed in this attempt. As dawn approached, casting soft golden light through the chamber windows, something remarkable happened that none of them had quite expected so soon. Draven's eyes, closed for so many days in troubled, restless sleep, began to flutter slightly, as though consciousness itself was slowly returning after its long, dangerous absence. Edwin noticed first, moving quickly to Draven's side, checking his pulse with careful, practiced hands. His pulse is stronger, much stronger than it has been at any point during this illness. Colin rushed forward as well, kneeling beside the bed, watching intently as Draven's eyelids continued their slow, determined flutter. "Draven, can you hear me?" For a long, tense moment, nothing happened, and Colin feared he had imagined the earlier signs of returning consciousness. Then, slowly, deliberately, Draven's eyes opened fully, focusing weakly at first, before gradually sharpening into recognition. "Colin," he whispered, his voice hoarse and rough from days of disuse, but unmistakably clearer than the faint mumbling of previous brief moments of consciousness. Colin let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 12 entire days, relief flooding through every feature of his exhausted face. "Yes, I am here. You are safe. You are going to be all right." Draven's gaze shifted slowly around the chamber, taking in Edwin's tired but joyful expression, before settling curiously on Elena, who stood slightly apart from the others, uncertain of her place in this intimate moment between king and commander. "Who is this?" Draven asked weakly, his sharp eyes, even in his weakened state, studying Elena with evident curiosity. Colin turned, gesturing toward Elena, with clear respect, now evident in his tone. "This is Elena Voss, my lord. She identified what was truly ailing you, something 25 trained healers completely failed to recognize. She is the reason you are awake and speaking with us right now." Draven's brow furrowed slightly, clearly trying to process this information despite his weakened condition. 25 healers failed, and she succeeded? How is that possible? Elena stepped forward hesitantly, unsure how to properly address a king she had never expected to meet, let alone treat directly. "I simply noticed a pattern, my lord. Your special morning tea contained a root variety that closely resembled a beneficial herb but carried different, harmful properties when consumed in concentrated form over several days. It was accumulating slowly within your system." Draven studied her carefully, his sharp mind clearly working despite his physical exhaustion, piecing together the implications of what she had just explained. "The tea. Constance fell ill weeks ago, and someone else began preparing it." "Yes, my lord," Elena confirmed. "A temporary replacement sourced a different batch of root powder that appeared similar to the usual ingredient, but carried different underlying properties." Draven's expression shifted from confusion to something sharper, more calculating, despite his weakened state. If this substance closely resembles the usual ingredient, someone would have needed to specifically source this particular variety, knowing its effects. This was no accident. Colin's expression darkened considerably at these words, the same realization clearly striking him with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. "You believe this was deliberate?" "Consider the timing," Draven said, his voice growing slightly stronger as clarity returned to his weakened mind. "Constance falls ill precisely when a temporary replacement is needed. That replacement sources a substitute ingredient that happens to closely resemble the usual herb while carrying harmful properties. This required specific knowledge and deliberate planning." Edwin, listening carefully to this exchange, nodded slowly, his own suspicions aligning with Draven's sharp observations. "It does seem remarkably coincidental, now that you describe it that way, my lord. Constance has served this castle faithfully for many years, never falling ill in such a sudden, convenient manner before." Elena, though relieved beyond words that her diagnosis had proven correct, and that Draven was now conscious and recovering, felt a chill settle over her at the implications now surfacing within this conversation. She had assumed her involvement would end with successfully identifying and treating the illness itself, not uncovering what appeared to be a deliberate attempt against the king's life. "Someone within this castle wanted me dead," Draven said quietly, his sharp eyes scanning the chamber, as though searching for answers, among familiar walls that suddenly seemed less secure than they had before this crisis began. Someone with access to my personal tea preparation, someone who understood exactly which substitute ingredient would produce these specific, difficult-to-diagnose symptoms. Colin's jaw tightened, his earlier relief now mixing uneasily with fresh concern. We must investigate immediately. If someone within our own walls orchestrated this, they remain here, likely watching to see whether their plan succeeded. Draven nodded weakly, though determination burned clearly in his sharp gaze, despite his physical exhaustion. Find Constance. Determine whether her illness was genuine or arranged. Find whoever suggested the substitute supplier for the root powder. Someone within these walls orchestrated this carefully, and I intend to discover exactly who. As Colin moved to organize this investigation immediately, Draven's attention returned to Elena, studying her with an intensity that made her slightly uncomfortable despite the gratitude evident in his sharp gaze. "You saved my life," he said quietly, his voice carrying genuine weight despite its weakened state. 25 healers, the finest minds across the 12 territories, failed completely, yet you identified the cause within minutes of entering this chamber. Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks under his direct attention, unused to such intense focus from anyone, let alone a king she had only just met under such extraordinary circumstances.
"I simply noticed details others overlooked, my lord."
My mother taught me to observe carefully. Nothing more remarkable than that. Nothing more remarkable, Draven repeated, something almost amused flickering briefly across his tired features, despite the seriousness surrounding them. You underestimate yourself considerably, it seems. Most people, faced with such a mystery, would have deferred entirely to established expertise, rather than trusting their own careful observations. Edwin, listening to this exchange with evident approval, stepped forward gently. "My lord, you should rest now. Your body has endured tremendous strain, and while your condition has improved remarkably, you require continued care and recovery time before regaining full strength." Draven nodded reluctantly, clearly wanting to continue the conversation despite his physical limitations. "Very well. But I wish to speak with you further, Elena Voss, once I have regained sufficient strength. What you accomplished here deserves proper recognition, and I have questions I wish to ask you directly." Elena nodded, uncertain how to respond appropriately to such a direct request from the Alpha King himself. "Of course, my lord. Whatever you require." As Draven settled back against his pillows, exhaustion finally overtaking his determination to remain alert, Edwin gently checked his vital signs once more, confirming continued improvement despite the fatigue now claiming him. Colin, meanwhile, had already departed to begin investigating the deliberate poisoning that had nearly claimed his king's life. Elena stood quietly near the chamber doorway, watching as Draven drifted into what appeared to be genuinely restful sleep for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, his breathing steady and deep, his color continuing to improve with each passing hour. She felt an overwhelming mixture of relief, exhaustion, and something else entirely. A strange awareness that her simple life as a tavern waitress had irrevocably changed the moment she stepped into this castle. She had come seeking only to help, never imagining that her involvement would extend beyond identifying and treating an illness that had baffled the finest healers in the 12 territories. Now, standing in this grand chamber as dawn light filtered through tall windows, Elena realized that uncovering the king's illness was merely the beginning of a much larger, more dangerous mystery, one that involved betrayal within the castle's own walls, and a king whose sharp, curious gaze suggested he had no intention of simply thanking her and sending her back to her ordinary life. Colin Marsh wasted no time following Draven's instructions. Within an hour, he had summoned every servant who worked within the castle kitchens, questioning each one carefully about the recent changes to the king's morning tea preparation. Most offered little useful information, beyond confirming that Constance Reeves had indeed fallen ill several weeks earlier, forcing Fiona Blackwood to temporarily assume her duties. Colin then sought out Constance herself, finding her resting in the servants' quarters, still appearing genuinely unwell, though something about her overly cautious responses to his questions struck him as slightly rehearsed. "Tell me exactly how your illness began," Colin instructed, his tone firm but not accusatory, wanting to observe her natural reactions rather than immediately alerting her to suspicion. Constance, an older woman with kind eyes that nonetheless flickered nervously under Colin's steady gaze, described a sudden stomach ailment that had struck her without warning several weeks earlier. Her explanation seemed reasonable enough on the surface, yet certain details felt slightly inconsistent when Colin compared them against typical illness patterns he had witnessed among pack members over the years. "Who suggested you rest at home, rather than continuing your duties despite feeling unwell?" Colin asked carefully, watching her expression closely. Constance hesitated, just briefly, before answering. "Lady Vivian suggested it, actually. She said she noticed I appeared unwell during morning preparations, and insisted I rest properly, rather than risk worsening my condition." Colin's expression remained carefully neutral, despite the sudden spike of suspicion this answer triggered within him. Lady Vivian, who had been so vocal in her skepticism toward Elena throughout this entire ordeal, now appeared connected directly to the very illness that had created the opportunity for someone to introduce the harmful root powder into Draven's tea. "And who suggested Fiona Blackwood specifically take over your duties during your absence?" Colin continued, keeping his tone conversational despite the mounting significance of each answer. "Lady Vivian again," Constance admitted. "She mentioned Fiona had experience assisting in the kitchens previously, and suggested she would manage the preparation adequately until I recovered." Colin thanked Constance for her cooperation, instructing her to remain within the castle until further notice, before immediately seeking out Fiona Blackwood to verify these details from her own perspective. Fiona, still nervous from her earlier questioning during Elena's investigation, confirmed everything Constance had described. "Yes, Commander. Lady Vivian approached me directly, suggesting I take over the preparation, and even recommending the substitute supplier for the root powder, when our usual source ran short unexpectedly." This confirmation sent a cold chill through Colin's chest. Lady Vivian, a distant cousin of the royal bloodline who had spent years positioning herself close to matters of state, appeared directly connected to every significant decision that had ultimately led to Draven's near-fatal illness. Colin immediately sought out Odette Ferris, the castle's trusted advisor who managed daily affairs, sharing his growing suspicions and requesting additional information regarding Lady Vivian's recent activities and connections. Odette listened carefully, her sharp mind already working through the implications as Colin explained each piece of evidence he had gathered. "This aligns disturbingly well with certain observations I have made recently myself, Commander. Lady Vivian has grown increasingly vocal about matters of succession over recent months, particularly regarding concerns about Draven's continued unmarried status and the potential instability this creates for future pack leadership." "You believe she sought to eliminate him, positioning herself or an ally closer to the throne in his absence?" Colin asked, though the question felt almost rhetorical given the mounting evidence. "It would explain her behavior throughout this entire crisis," Odette confirmed. "Her excessive skepticism toward any potential cure, her persistent presence throughout every development, always positioned to monitor progress closely. Someone genuinely hoping for the king's recovery would not display such consistent doubt toward every possible solution offered." Colin immediately ordered increased surveillance on Lady Vivian's movements, careful not to alert her to the growing suspicion surrounding her actions. He also arranged for guards to quietly search her private chambers, searching for any additional evidence that might confirm her involvement in this elaborate scheme. Meanwhile, back in Draven's recovery chamber, the king continued improving steadily throughout the following day, his strength gradually returning as his body fully processed and eliminated the harmful toxin that had nearly claimed his life. Edwin monitored his progress closely, expressing genuine amazement at how quickly Draven's condition continued improving, now that the underlying cause had finally been correctly identified. Elena remained nearby throughout much of this recovery period, uncertain whether her presence was still required or appropriate, yet unwilling to simply leave without understanding the full resolution of everything that had unfolded. She found herself drawn into quiet conversations with Edwin, who seemed genuinely interested in learning more about the practical knowledge her mother had passed down over the years. "Your mother sounds like she possessed remarkable insight," Edwin commented, during one such conversation, as Elena helped him organize various herbs and remedies within Draven's chamber. "It seems a shame such practical knowledge often goes unrecognized within formal medical circles. She always believed that careful observation mattered more than formal credentials," Elena replied thoughtfully. "She used to say that illness often reveals itself through patterns, if only people take the time to truly look, rather than rushing toward complicated explanations." Edwin nodded slowly, considering her words carefully. I have practiced medicine formally for 30 years, yet you identified something within minutes that eluded my expertise entirely, along with 24 other trained healers. Perhaps there is wisdom in combining formal training with the kind of careful, patient observation your mother taught you. Their conversation was interrupted when Colin returned to the chamber, his expression grave despite the positive developments regarding Draven's continued recovery. He requested a private word with Edwin, stepping just outside the chamber doors, though Elena could hear fragments of their hushed conversation despite their attempts at discretion. When Colin finally re-entered the chamber, his expression remained troubled, though he offered Elena a brief, appreciative nod before approaching Draven's bedside directly. "My lord, we have made significant progress in our investigation," Colin reported, keeping his voice low despite Draven's improved alertness. "The evidence increasingly points toward Lady Vivian Ashworth's direct involvement in orchestrating your poisoning." Draven's expression darkened considerably at this news, though his sharp mind immediately began processing the implications with characteristic clarity, despite his continued physical recovery. "Vivian, I should have suspected her sooner, given her persistent concerns regarding succession matters. We have not yet confirmed everything with absolute certainty," Colin cautioned, "but the pattern of evidence is difficult to ignore." She arranged for Constance's convenient absence, suggested Fiona as the temporary replacement, and specifically recommended the substitute supplier for the root powder that ultimately caused your illness. Draven's jaw tightened, anger flickering beneath his still recovering features. "What does she hope to gain from my death? I have no immediate heir, which would create significant instability, hardly beneficial to anyone, with legitimate claims to leadership. Perhaps that instability itself was her intention," Colin suggested carefully. "If you had died without a clear successor, various factions might have competed for leadership, potentially creating an opportunity for Vivian, or an ally, to seize control amid the resulting chaos." Draven considered this theory carefully, his expression grim as the full scope of the betrayal became clearer. "We must proceed carefully. If she suspects we have identified her involvement, she may attempt to flee or take further desperate action. I have already arranged discreet surveillance," Colin confirmed. "We will gather sufficient evidence before confronting her directly, ensuring we have an airtight case that leaves no room for denial or escape." As this conversation continued, Elena listened quietly from her position near the chamber's edge, increasingly aware that she had inadvertently become entangled in matters far more serious and dangerous than she had ever anticipated when she first agreed to accompany Gareth Hollis to the castle. What had begun as a simple attempt to help identify an unknown illness had evolved into uncovering a deliberate assassination attempt orchestrated by someone within the king's own extended family. She wondered, with growing unease, what role she might be expected to play as this dangerous situation continued unfolding, and whether her involvement in exposing Lady Vivian's scheme might place her in any personal danger, given the stakes now clearly at play within these castle walls. 3 days passed as Colin's investigation continued gathering evidence, each piece strengthening the case against Lady Vivian beyond reasonable doubt. Guards discovered correspondence hidden within her private chambers, letters exchanged with a distant lord from a rival territory, who had long harbored ambitions of expanding his influence should the Ashford pack fall into disarray following Draven's death. The letters revealed a carefully constructed plan. Lady Vivian would arrange for Draven's death through means difficult to trace back to any specific poison or curse, creating exactly the kind of mysterious illness that had baffled 25 healers. In the resulting chaos and uncertainty surrounding succession, she would position herself as a stabilizing figure, ultimately forming an alliance with the rival lord that would grant him significant influence over Ashford territory, in exchange for supporting her claim to authority. Armed with this evidence, along with confirmed testimony from both Constance and Fiona regarding Vivian's specific instructions, Colin finally felt confident enough to proceed with a direct confrontation. He discussed his findings thoroughly with Draven, who had continued recovering steadily, and now possessed sufficient strength to participate directly in exposing this betrayal. "I want to confront her myself," Draven insisted, despite Edwin's continued concerns regarding his recovery. "She attempted to take my life, and threatened the stability of everything my family has built. I will not hide weakly in this chamber, while others handle this matter on my behalf." Edwin reluctantly agreed, provided Draven remained seated and avoided unnecessary physical strain during the confrontation. Colin arranged for Lady Vivian to be summoned to the Grand Council chamber, along with several key witnesses and advisors, unaware that this would be far more than the routine meeting she likely expected. Elena, who had remained at the castle throughout this entire investigation, found herself invited to attend as well, given her crucial role in uncovering the initial diagnosis that had ultimately led to this discovery. She stood near the back of the chamber, watching nervously as Lady Vivian entered, her elegant composure evident despite whatever suspicions she may have harbored regarding the summons. "You wish to see me, my lord?" Vivian asked, offering a graceful curtsy toward Draven, who now sat upright in a chair positioned prominently at the front of the chamber, still pale, but undeniably alert and commanding despite his recent illness. "I did," Draven replied, his voice carrying the authority Elena remembered from the moment she first encountered him, now fully returned despite his continued recovery. "I wish to thank you personally for your concern throughout my recent illness." Vivian's expression flickered, something briefly uncertain crossing her features before her composed mask returned firmly into place. "Of course, my lord. I was terribly worried throughout your ordeal, as anyone in this pack would be." "Indeed," Draven continued, his tone deceptively casual despite the tension building steadily throughout the chamber. "It seems fortunate that Constance fell ill, precisely when she did, allowing Fiona to step in and prepare my tea using a substitute ingredient that ultimately caused my illness. Fortunate, or perhaps something else entirely." Vivian's composure cracked slightly at these words, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly before she quickly regained her outward calm. "I am not certain what you mean to imply, my lord." "I believe you understand precisely what I mean," Draven replied, his voice hardening considerably now, all pretense of casual conversation abandoned. "Colin, please present our evidence." Colin stepped forward, methodically presenting the testimony gathered from Constance and Fiona, along with the incriminating correspondence discovered within Vivian's private chambers. As each piece of evidence was revealed, Vivian's composure crumbled further, her elegant mask giving way to increasing desperation as the full scope of her exposed scheme became undeniable before the gathered witnesses. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted, though her voice now carried a distinct edge of panic beneath its attempted calm. "I merely suggested Constance rest when she appeared unwell. I had no knowledge that the substitute root powder would cause any harm. And yet, your correspondence with Lord Ashcombe suggests otherwise," Colin countered firmly, holding up the damning letters for the entire chamber to witness. "These letters clearly outline your plan to eliminate the king and position yourself favorably amid the resulting instability, in exchange for granting Lord Ashcombe significant influence over our territory." Vivian's face drained of color entirely as she realized the complete extent of evidence gathered against her. Her earlier composure shattered completely, replaced by desperate, scrambling denial that convinced no one within the chamber. "You would have destroyed everything my family has built," Draven said quietly, though his quiet tone carried far more weight than any shout could have managed. "Not through honorable challenge or open conflict, but through poison, hidden within my own morning tea, disguised carefully enough to escape detection by 25 skilled healers. I only sought stability for this pack," Vivian protested weakly, though her words rang hollow given the overwhelming evidence against her. "You have no heir, no clear successor. I feared what chaos might follow your continued unmarried status." "That fear did not grant you the right to attempt murder," Draven replied firmly, his authority absolute despite his continued physical recovery from her attempted crime. "Guards, take Lady Vivian into custody. She will face formal judgment for her actions against this pack and its leadership." As guards moved forward to escort the now visibly shaking Vivian from the chamber, she cast one final, desperate glance around the room, perhaps searching for any remaining sympathy among those gathered. She found none. Even those advisors who had once respected her position and influence now regarded her with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust at the betrayal she had orchestrated. Once she had been removed from the chamber, tension slowly began releasing throughout the remaining gathering, replaced by quiet relief that this dangerous chapter had finally reached its conclusion. Draven remained seated, visibly exhausted from the confrontation, despite his determination to see it through personally. "This matter is finally resolved," Colin said, addressing the remaining advisors and witnesses gathered within the chamber. Lord Ashcombe will be dealt with through appropriate diplomatic and military channels, given his involvement in this conspiracy. For now, our immediate concern must be ensuring our king's continued recovery and restoring stability throughout our territory. The gathered crowd slowly began dispersing, quiet conversations breaking out regarding the shocking revelation they had just witnessed. Elena remained near the back of the chamber, uncertain whether to approach Draven directly or simply await further instruction regarding her continued presence at the castle. Draven, however, noticed her lingering presence, gesturing for her to approach despite his evident exhaustion. "Elena, please, come closer." She approached hesitantly, uncertain what he wished to discuss given everything that had just unfolded. "Yes, my lord?" "None of this would have been possible without your initial diagnosis," Draven said quietly, his sharp eyes studying her carefully despite his physical exhaustion. "Had you not identified the true cause of my illness, I would likely have died without ever discovering the betrayal orchestrated against me. This entire scheme would have succeeded completely, and Lord Ashcombe would now be maneuvering to seize influence over territory that has belonged to my family for generations." Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks under his direct, appreciative gaze. "I am simply relieved. Everything has been resolved successfully, my lord. I never anticipated my involvement extending this far when I first agreed to accompany Gareth Hollis here several days ago." "And yet here you remain," Draven observed, something thoughtful flickering across his tired features. "I find myself curious, what will become of your involvement moving forward, given everything you have accomplished during your time within these walls?" Elena hesitated, uncertain how to respond appropriately to such a question, given the significant difference in their respective positions and circumstances. "I assumed I would return to my previous life, my lord, now that your recovery seems assured, and this dangerous matter has been properly resolved." Draven studied her for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his sharp features despite his obvious exhaustion. "Perhaps we should discuss this further, once I have regained sufficient strength to properly consider what your continued presence might offer this castle and this pack, beyond the remarkable service you have already provided." Elena nodded uncertainly, sensing that this conversation, brief as it was, represented merely the beginning of something far more significant than she had initially anticipated when she first stepped through the castle's imposing gates several days earlier. Uncertain and out of place among nobles and warriors, far removed from her ordinary life as a humble tavern waitress. 2 weeks passed following Lady Vivian's exposure and removal from the castle. Draven's recovery continued steadily throughout this period, his strength gradually returning to the point where he resumed most of his usual duties, though Edwin insisted on careful monitoring given the severity of what his body had endured. Elena had remained at the castle throughout this recovery period, though her exact role remained somewhat undefined during those 2 weeks. She assisted Edwin occasionally, sharing additional practical knowledge her mother had taught her over the years, information the experienced physician found genuinely valuable, despite his decades of formal training. She also found herself drawn into occasional conversations with various castle staff, gradually becoming a familiar, if still somewhat unusual, presence within these grand walls. Word of her role in identifying Draven's illness, and ultimately exposing Lady Vivian's betrayal, had spread throughout the entire territory, transforming public perception of the quiet tavern waitress into something far more significant. Villagers who had once known her only as a friendly server at the Copper Kettle now spoke of her with genuine awe, sharing stories of how she had accomplished what 25 trained healers could not. Despite this growing recognition, Elena remained uncertain about her future, torn between the comfortable familiarity of her previous life and the strange, unexpected path that fate had placed before her within these castle walls. She had written to her employer at the tavern, explaining her extended absence, though she had not yet decided whether to return permanently or continue exploring whatever opportunities might exist for her here. On a quiet afternoon, as autumn sunlight filtered pleasantly through the castle's grand windows, Draven summoned her to his private study, a smaller, more personal space than the grand chambers she had grown accustomed to over recent weeks. She found him standing near a window, gazing out over the training grounds where warriors practiced their combat skills below. "You summoned me, my lord?" Elena asked, standing respectfully near the doorway. Draven turned, gesturing for her to enter fully, rather than lingering near the entrance. "Please, come in." I have been considering our previous conversation regarding your future here, and I believe I have reached a decision worth discussing directly with you. Elena stepped further into the study, curiosity mixing with nervous anticipation regarding what he might propose. I am listening, my lord. You saved my life, Draven began, his voice carrying quiet sincerity that Elena had come to recognize as genuine rather than merely diplomatic. More than that, your involvement led directly to exposing a betrayal that could have destroyed everything my family has built across generations. This is not a debt easily repaid through simple gratitude alone. I require no repayment, my lord, Elena replied honestly. I acted simply because I recognized an opportunity to help, using knowledge my mother passed down to me. I never expected anything beyond the satisfaction of successfully treating your illness. Perhaps not, Draven acknowledged, but I believe your talents deserve recognition beyond mere gratitude. I would like to offer you a permanent position here, within this castle, serving as my personal healer and advisor on matters of health and wellness throughout our pack. Elena's eyes widened slightly at this unexpected proposal, uncertainty flickering across her features despite the evident honor such an offer represented. My lord, I have no formal medical training. Surely such a position requires expertise beyond what I possess. You possess something far more valuable than formal training alone, Draven countered firmly. You possess genuine insight, careful observation, and the wisdom to recognize patterns others overlook entirely. Edwin has expressed considerable respect for your abilities throughout these past weeks, suggesting formal training could be arranged alongside your practical knowledge, combining both approaches into something genuinely unique and valuable. Elena considered this proposal carefully, weighing the significant change it would represent against her comfortable, familiar life at the Copper Kettle Tavern. This is a considerable decision, my lord. I would need time to properly consider everything such a position would entail. Of course, Draven agreed readily. Take whatever time you require. However, I want you to understand something clearly before you make your decision. Elena studied him curiously, sensing something shifting in his tone, despite his continued formal address. What is that, my lord? Draven stepped closer, his sharp eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly despite herself. This offer extends beyond mere professional consideration alone. During these past weeks of recovery, I have come to genuinely respect and admire your character, your intelligence, and your quiet courage in stepping forward, despite significant uncertainty and skepticism from those around you. Elena felt her heart quicken at these words, uncertain how to properly interpret the genuine warmth evident beneath his usually commanding demeanor. My lord, I am uncertain what you mean to suggest. I mean simply that I have no intention of allowing you to walk away from this castle and disappear back into obscurity, Draven said, his voice softening considerably, despite its underlying firmness. Whatever role you ultimately choose here, whether purely professional or something deeper, I would consider it a genuine loss to see you return entirely to your previous life, without exploring what possibilities might exist between us. Elena stood quietly for a long moment, processing the significant weight behind his words, understanding clearly now that this conversation extended far beyond simple professional consideration alone. You are asking me to remain here, near you, beyond merely serving as your healer. I am asking you to consider it, Draven clarified gently. I make no demands, Elena. You have already given more to this pack than anyone could reasonably expect. Whatever you decide, know that my gratitude remains genuine and unconditional. However, I would be lying if I claimed my interest in your continued presence here stemmed purely from professional consideration. Elena felt warmth spreading through her chest, despite her earlier uncertainty, genuine affection stirring within her for this man, who had shown her nothing but respect and gratitude since the moment she first walked into his chamber, uncertain and out of place among skeptical nobles and warriors. I will need time to consider everything properly, she said finally, though a genuine smile now graced her features, despite her careful, measured words. But I believe I would like to remain here, at least for now, and explore what possibilities this new path might offer. Draven's expression brightened considerably at her response, something genuinely warm, replacing his usual commanding demeanor. That is all I could reasonably ask for. Take whatever time you require, Elena. I will remain patient, however long that process might take. As autumn continued transforming into winter throughout the following weeks, Elena gradually settled into her new role within the castle, working alongside Edwin to develop combined approaches that honored both formal medical training and the practical, observational wisdom her mother had passed down through years of patient teaching. Her reputation continued growing throughout the territory, no longer simply as the waitress who had once solved an impossible mystery, but as a genuinely respected healer in her own right. Her relationship with Draven developed gradually as well, evolving naturally from professional respect into something deeper and more meaningful over time, built upon genuine mutual admiration rather than mere obligation or convenience. The castle that had once felt so foreign and intimidating gradually became a place she genuinely called home, filled with people who had come to respect and value her presence for exactly who she was. Looking back on everything that had transpired since that fateful evening when Gareth Hollis first walked into the Copper Kettle Tavern, Elena often marveled at how dramatically her simple, ordinary life had transformed through a single moment of careful observation and quiet courage. 25 skilled healers had failed to save their king, yet fate had chosen an unassuming waitress to accomplish what seemed impossible, forever changing her destiny alongside that of the powerful Alpha King she had once approached with such uncertain, nervous hesitation. What began as a simple errand to gather supplies for a desperate castle had ultimately led to saving a king's life, exposing a dangerous betrayal, and discovering an unexpected path toward genuine happiness that Elena could never have imagined when she first began her ordinary shift at the tavern, that quiet, unremarkable evening, so many weeks earlier.